This talk is going to deal with the two opposites on the continuum, the high context culture and the low context culture. So I'm going to look at both of these in today's lecture. Okay, to start with, a high context culture is a culture in which the context of the message and you all understand context meaning surroundings. The context of the message or the action or an event carries a large part of its meaning and significance. So what this means is that in a high context culture, more attention is paid to what's happening in and around the message or event than to the message itself. So more attention is paid to what's going on around the words or the event than to the actual event or message. I said I'm going to look at three areas: interpersonal relationships, personal space, and time. Okay, in a high context culture, in terms of interpersonal relationships, one thing that you might find very clearly is that there's a strong dependence on shared or built-in pre-programmed information concerning a message or event. Okay, what about personal space? Generally, in a high context culture, because there's a greater dependency on group thinking, people lean towards heavier sensory involvement or closeness to people. And they have less respect for privacy, for personal space, or what we might call a bubble of personal space. And if you go into that culture, people might stand closer when they're talking to you. They might touch more. And if they are jostled in a crowd or touched inadvertently, they won't feel as violated as someone from a low context culture would, perhaps. Also, people from a high context culture pay attention to body language, because remember what I said, the definition of a high context culture is that more attention is paid to the context of the message than to the message itself. And part of the context is body language. Okay, what about time? In high context cultures, generally they're considered to have what is called a polychronic attitude towards time. Okay. In high context cultures, they have what is generally called a polychronic attitude towards time. And if you take a look at this word here, you'll see you have two separate meanings: chron indicating time, poly indicating many. So what this means here is that a society that has a polychronic attitude towards time believes that people, things, events have their own time. They believe that there can't be one standard system of time for everything. And what this leads them to believe is that you can't emphasize punctuality. Things happen when they're supposed to happen. So there's a different attitude towards time. There's no set standard of time, or they don't see time in that way. That is, there's a sense that you can't control time. Everything has its own sense of time, so it's a culture that pays little attention to clock time. Okay. A low context culture is just the opposite. A low context culture is one in which the message, the event, or the action is a separate entity, having meaning unto itself, regardless of the surroundings, regardless of the context. So what this means in a low context culture is that people pay more attention to the event itself, rather than to the context which surrounds the event, which is exactly the opposite of a high context culture. What about personal space? Again, that's the opposite of a high context culture. Remember, in a low context culture, there's more emphasis on individuality. And so the concept of privacy is very, very important. Whereas before, as I said, in a high context culture, they might not even be concerned with privacy or personal space. But in a low context culture, there is a feeling that we each have our own personal space, that people in a low context culture believe that there's one standard of time, and that should be for everything.